thank you for filling me in as to your children and as to your community, the project, the Stumping Grounds, the short story collection, and all these endeavors, which of course dovetail.
Yeah,
Thank you for that.
of course.
I've been thinking about what it means to grow, what it means, not what it is, because that is self-evident. But what does it mean? A dime or a nickel. Here is some piece of matter with inscription, with an artificial imposition of idea put on it. I want it to look like or resemble this figure and have some language that can be read so that this piece of matter can be circulated like air through the hands, which serve as lungs for this thing we call an economy. Does the form of the nickel or the dime eclipse the meaning of 5 cents or 10 cents? Or does the 10 cents or 5 cents loom in the background as shadow, since there is such a thing as inflation? And that can be calibrated, that can be string pulled, and then can lead to conspiracies of those who find their pieces of matter mattering less, looking up, as it were, to the echelons of those with the other end of the string in hand and saying, I thought we were supposed to breathe together, be symbiotic in this polis. But apparently, you're taking away the meaning of my form that allows for, that affords, in every sense of the term, the conduct of my life, the raising of my family, the investing resources into my projects or enterprises. And those enterprises are expressions of my aim or wish or desire or goals. And how all that is bound up in the philosophical question of form and function. So what does that spring for you?
I think that's a fascinating question. I was speaking with Thomas Jockin, and he's a tremendous Aristotle scholar. He'll talk about Aquinas, he'll talk about the classics. We do a lot of work on beauty in Plato, and how that has been misunderstood. Also, he'll talk about will lack in Aristotle, and how when we think of form and we think of metaphysics, we need to really understand that Aristotle is constantly orbiting a lack, and what that term means is a present absence. So, for example, the principle, as we've talked about before, the principle that keeps the bookcase as it changes through time. All we experience in physics is change, and yet somehow things stay stable as there is only change in time. And so there's this present absence, this lack, which is not nothing. Lack is not nothing. It is this apophatic principle that makes a thing what it is that is also very full. But I bring all this up because we were talking about, obviously, the famous causes, the four causes, and how it's just very interesting how almost it is extremely important to always think all four at the same time, that they check and balance one another. And that if you don't remember all four, then one can kind of take over the rest. And as a result, you get a miscalibration, a misfit understanding of a thing, right? Because like when we talk about, obviously you have your first calls, your formal calls, your efficient calls, and your final calls. And these can be difficult to keep apart in one's mind. But there's something about how when Aquinas, Aquinas obviously with his proofs of God, which again I would almost argue they're not necessarily proofs as they are almost names of God. Like if God exists, he would actually be of this quality, right? Et cetera, et cetera. But with Aristotle, like so as an example, if we overemphasize the first cause, as in, what gets things moving, we might become determinists, right? Where everything is just determined by the first cause, right? If we overemphasize the final cause, then we may become kind of bad Gnostics, where nothing matters except the end, out of materiality, getting to heaven at the expense of materiality, or maybe the means justify the ends, right? The ends justify the means, because the final cause becomes predominant. If we overemphasize the efficient cause, we may become pragmatists, we may become utilitarians, and maybe even reductionists as well, because we kind of reduce things to the reason they were made, like the kind of the principle for their very animation. And then the formal calls, and correct me if I get any of these mistaken. I always kind of confuse the formal and efficient calls. I'm trying to get better, but those two's always blur in my mind.
Same here.
But
Same here.
but with the formal calls on the idea of, and it's not merely shape, but the way Jock, if I recall how Jock would describe it, is when the spear maker is making a bronze spear, there is a certain form that the spear maker is trying to make the bronze into, right? And it would be a mistake to say shape. It's more like a pattern. And this pattern, though, this is where it becomes interesting. This pattern, you go, yes, I've done it. When it meets its efficient calls, now it's going to be able to be effective as a weapon. And you can also see the final calls of what it might be toward, and then you can also see the first calls and the cause and effect that made the spear. So what's always very interesting is that in the formal calls, it almost can be the best bridge to bring these things together, actually. And this starts to, I think, hint at why form is such a big concept in classical thought, right? And so when we talk about form and function, what is very interesting is that if I start thinking about function without form, then of course, how can I even talk of function unless there's some sort of form that lends itself to a certain function, right? And also, if I'm trying to form a bronze spear, well, isn't there a certain function I am after that I'm seeking a certain form in? So there's something about form and function that lend itself to one another, that also in that very stitching almost automatically assumes a first cause and a final cause, right? And perhaps many of our metaphysical mistakes are world that we see in various worldviews, whether it be reductionism, all the ones, nihilism, etc., so forth. Maybe these are products of losing one of the four causes and not keeping them knitted together, that we end up in some sort of problem. And I think what's interesting, like when you're talking about money, like if we start going, okay, is the 5 cents more dominant, the meaning of 5 cents more dominant than, say, the coin itself, the form of the coin, like the meaning the coin has over. But then what's so interesting is that can then lead to, like you said, conspiracies, right? Where you're talking about Jekyll Isle and these people that are pulling the strings, and which is more real? The participation in the economy that money affords as a form. And of course, money is so odd because it's, if it's a dollar bill, it's a piece of paper. And yet it seems silly to say it's just a piece of paper, right? And yet it is just a piece of paper. I always think money is fundamentally metaphysical. Like it has to be as a something of which, as the material of paper, nevertheless has a function beyond paperness. Right, that it participates in the society. Well, right there, we're talking about we're talking about something that it has a form. Really, money is a form. It is not merely a shape, and it is not merely a material. It is a social form. And I think also critically, You know, Wittgenstein was famous for saying there's no such thing as a private language. I sometimes think we can think of there's no such thing as a private form. Like for Aristotle and Plato to talk of forms, they're speaking about something social. It's like when they're talking about the forms of reality, it's like they're not just me. These forms clearly exist because we organize our behavior as human beings around an apprehension of these forms, and society also orbits these forms. So there's no such thing as a private form. Wouldn't it be easy if it was? Because then it would be easy to say it's imaginary. It'd be easy to say there's nothing to it. But the very fact that forms are things of which are intelligible to no one in particular, and that in fact we can share, suggests that the very ground that makes possible the social is tied to the form. It is tied to some formation. And the question and the issue becomes, if we get form and function out of balance, it threatens the social. And I think we see that when people are talking about Jekyll or conspiracies. That creates these kind of knitted, crystallized, we have the truth, other people don't. It starts taking people out of the social. And yet at the same time, there is such thing as real manipulation, right? There is, unfortunately, the possibility of people being taken advantage of. And I think, these are just some kind of opening thoughts. I think basically, if we're not able, if we don't have something like philosophy, or just like what very often you could say that church, if it's teaching theology, is trying to keep form and function together, where you're not too far on the side of function as utility, but also not too far on the side of just thinking, say, the forms, that you're not functioning in society or that you're not participating in the society. There's some sort of tension between those two things, or where you see yourself as dysfunctional because, say, you're poor and these people are rich, so maybe you're dysfunctional, and the church reminds you, well, the first will be last and the last will be first, right? So there's this teaching to remind people, don't get too far on the side of function, don't get too far on the side of form, and without, which again, of course, would say you're keeping the four causes together. You're trying to keep them all together. You can see church is almost always trying to keep the four causes together in people's minds and in their daily lives. But if the church isn't attended or it doesn't have authority, then people are finding themselves ill-equipped to not end up too far on the side of form or far on the side of function. And I suppose, as just opening thoughts, it seems as if this tension you're pointing to between form and function is kind of a lifelong work of maintaining the mean, kind of maintaining it. And it's not self-evident when you do it right or wrong, suggesting the need for community or regular work. But how do we do that, if the social fabric is tearing, et cetera, so forth. So for me, it is very interesting to think about the work of maintaining the four causes, or just to shorthand it here, a kind of perpetual lifelong work of maintaining form and function together, not losing sight of form and function, not losing sight of function and form, and actually ever judging the mean to maintain those things. Just some opening thoughts, Mr. Allison.
Lovely. And I appreciate your turn of phrase or your concision with respect to mean and finding the mean as we are trying to mean something with our question, what does it mean to grow?
Yeah.
So that rehearsal of the four causes is helpful as tools, as utensils for us to begin to delect this table. So I'll say first off what I'm reminded of based on what you said, and we'll see where it goes from there. Bitsky, I've been reading lately, Dr. Bitsky, I think that's how I pronounce his last name. He who is credited with the phrase and the popularity of the phrase, the rhetorical situation. And I don't mean to go on the flip side of the coin to the myth of the rhetorical situation, which was proffered by someone else. Here I want to stay on the side of not Tails, but Bitsky. And why I bring up the rhetorical situation in this case is in his article, he makes the rhetorical situation a place of convergences, a place wherein a number of other things, which are not the place, so to speak, have to be together in order for what comes up out of the situation to have its kind of motion, have its kind of bearing on all the others. And one can start to have a synesthetic view on the speaker emitting sounds from the throat as a sort of up from these converging factors. I remember reading somewhere an advertiser working for Coca-Cola talking about the slice of the pie of the average throat that they wanted to inhabit on a daily basis with their orange juice. And that they looked at this pie chart that was supposed to resemble the throat that can only take so much volume of liquid a day. And you can parse out those hours in the day to when people drink from the tap or stop at a gas station or walk down the aisle and see the various bottles and make a decision as to what they're going to drink. And because we have cravings for sweetness, cravings for, as it were, the clarity of water, because we otherwise would be dehydrated. And some of us have fond memories of earlier advertising with how I should buy the world a Coke and install some kind of harmony. But there are only so many minutes in the day where we are parched and we have only so much discretionary income to spend on what isn't tap water, that pie chart can't just be looked at in toto, it has to be looked at in slivers. And then they figure out, according to whatever sliver they can work with, how to speak to that consumer. And the reason it's such a disadvantaged game for those who are consuming is these large companies that have legal monopolies on brand names can pour millions of dollars to psychologically target a small sliver of a person's time every day or every week, driven by the biological impulse to drink. Why am I even talking about that? I'm talking about that pie chart because it can stand for the rhetorical situation of Bitsky. The reality of certain depletions that have to be refilled on a regular basis, and that necessitating this uprising of a response to that need, which often is a response of sound, of consonants and vowels in an arrangement that is predetermined at the outset. That is to say, partakes of the first and final cause. Not to make a spear, but to make a bottle of Pepsi. And the other ones, the efficient and the, was it material? Formal, thank you. Those are taken care of, as it were, by our biology, by our human nature, by, depending on how spiritual one wants to become, our need. That makes good sense to me, that we live in a world where we can't all be Wittgenstein and sit around mostly in silence and every now and then rise up with well-numbered and well-defined words in numbered sentences. And we can't spend a long time in silence before we come out with an investigation. Most of us have to talk in the form of question and answer, response, antiphonal response. Here, I need this. There you go. Thanks. If I don't say thanks, you'll think I'm being rude. And because I don't have a theory of mind and can't go inside your consciousness transparently, I have to assume that social decorum, social dynamics dictate I say thank you, which I'm happy to do. But now I'm spiraled in a rhetorical situation. So with those two examples, the example of the pie chart throat, the example of social etiquette, we find ourselves, if we're allowed to be at table, we find ourselves having to conflate, for lack of a better word, the rhetorical and the ontological.
Yep.
And that rhetorical being somewhere mixed up in the froth of ontology as it's moving kinetically, because rhetoric understood in these terms is rhetoric as the four causes. So it's not just rhetoric of the mouth, it's rhetoric of the feet. So I suppose then that leads to a question that I'll pose to you. I want to pose to you, my dear friend. If community is inevitable because we have to meet one another's needs, it seems then we can have good community, or I don't want to put it that way. I don't want to make it good, not good.
Sure.
Because that doesn't seem to be adequate to the task. We can have healthy and growing, or we can have something in the ballpark of atrophy. And again, it's not a simple, well, this category, that category, when is it crossing the line? But it seems that we're refining our question somewhat from the generic, what does it mean to grow, to what does it mean to, you and I have harped the theme of awareness, right? In situation, having awareness, doing algebra while contoured by the geometric. And so really caring what the variable stands for, really caring. That is to say, phenomenologically alert about what we're saying when we say these philosophical words. What are we doing in dialogue between us for others, i.e. community, vis-a-vis community? How does that refinement of the question help us talk about becoming aware of healthy traits in community?
Excellent.
Especially if that's something rhetorically we want to encourage in all four senses of the cause of rhetoric.
Yep. Well, excellent. Well, so first off, it's interesting because when I go to the question that you've posed, that we're refining on what does it mean to grow, first off, for me, the first thing I want to say is that means you've made space. And I think because you can't have growth unless there's space in which the growth can be in too. And what's kind of very interesting is I think human beings, there's something about if we make our goal growth, then it's almost cancerous because we put it into our own power, where what we should be doing is creating spaces and then let the growth be what it is. And there's something about community that is what you're doing is creating the space, which is the condition of possibility for growth, but you don't worry about the growth because you let the spirit do that. Like if you're like, because it's almost like there's a problem which if the human focus is on growth, it almost always falls into efficient calls or utilitarianism or optimization or how do I do something better, right? Which is not inherently bad. It just depends on what you mean by that. But what's very interesting here is if we just stick to the four causes, Aristotle is suggesting that everything that exists has four causes, basically. That if it exists, it must have four causes. It must have a first cause, a formal cause, an efficient cause, and a final cause. The question is the following. Must words have all four causes, or must we as human beings be intentional about always speaking to all four causes? Because although things may have four causes, we as human beings seem to be capable of actually generating things that are deficient in their causes. Because when we speak, we say only speak efficiently. We forget the first cause and the formal cause and the efficient and the final. Or we only speak to the end and we forget the others, right? Also, in what humans create, spaces, churches, novels, friendships, etc., so forth, it seems possible for human beings to actually generate things that are deficient in one of the four causes. Now, not actually, because if you create it, it must have one even if you're unaware of it, but it seems as if we can be more aware or less aware of the harmony between the causes of the things we set in motion. And that seems to have an impact on if there's growth or not, because that seems to have an impact on if there's a space, a field into which the growth can occur, right? And perhaps one of the problems is when humans speak to one another, we are not aware enough of our words to pay attention on, are we maintaining the four causes in our dialogue? Like, are we forgetting the origin? Are we forgetting the final cause? Are we overemphasizing the efficient? Are we losing them? And there's something about speech which is automatically a failure because you can't perfectly speak all four at once. But in that failure, you can try. And here's the interesting thing, if there's something about humans that must fail, that actually then means there's almost necessarily the possibility of growth, unless we take there's a failure and an impossibility to improve, which I don't think is, to make a claim. Depends on what one means by total depravity, but there are dangers in emphasizing a total depravity to the point where nothing like sanctification is possible. I don't think that's biblical. I'm happy to go into that exegesis, and I'm not sure if even one becomes confused when you go to the original text, and predestination is a very small part of Calvin's Institutes, and the majority is about grace, and then you have to go into the exegesis. These thinkers tend to be different than how one is taught. But generally speaking, there is a notion in Christianity of total depravity, meaning you cannot improve. Now, if by that one means you cannot be the source of grace, God has to be the source of grace, of course. But there does seem to be something about fruits of the Spirit, the ability to work towards sanctification, that must be taken very, very seriously. And if we grant something like that is real, which I think is, because I think virtue exists, then this sort of improvement may be tied to a human's effort to harmonize or work through a failure they cannot avoid, which would seem to suggest total depravity, but would actually be the stage of the possibility of growth, because we can never perfectly keep in mind all four causes, which means there's a failure, but that is a failure inherent in speech that we can improve on once we are aware of it. So for me, if fallenness means there's some sort of irony or some sort of finitude in the human condition is set up for some sort of shortcoming that we have to tarry with, absolutely. That seems very biblical, that there's something about the human that in existing creates an obstacle for themselves. But then the sanctification is the working through that obstacle that humans are of themselves to cultivate virtue, to cultivate better capacities of community, etc., so forth. So then that very failure inherent in the human is actually the necessary stage upon which growth is thus afforded, right? And that seems to me to be interesting in the Speech Act, because if the Speech Act needs to maintain the four causes, in a sense, and it can't perfectly, well, then that's what we're kind of working through. And to me, this is where, when Wittgenstein says, for what one cannot speak, one must remain silent, famously, there actually is a sense in which the only thing we're supposed to try to speak about is the unspeakable. It's not that which you're not, it's like, actually, that is the thing you're supposed to speak about. And it is interesting that Wittgenstein becomes very mystical later, yes? He goes into Master Eckhart later on, almost kind of going, because there's an apophatic tradition that the key to the apophatic tradition is not that you don't speak, is that you fail at speaking. Intentionally fail at speaking. This is very different than not trying to speak. It is a certain sort of, let's write a poem, which is always a shortcoming and yet excellent in its shortcoming, right? So that, to me, is the failure that is the space of growth. Like, that is kind of the space in which growth is then in. And then the issue is, how do we as human beings then create spaces or community? These are, again, just kind of setting the thoughts coming to mind. I'll give it to you. Then this also then suggests, when one is designing churches or books or writing, that you're actually trying to almost create a space in which we have a better grasp on this inherent failure that is us, that affords the possibility of growth. Because the better we can understand, say, our inability to speak of God, which is precisely why there is this possibility of approaching God in a certain sort of failure, that is a kind of cultivation of virtue. Well, that's very paradoxical, but the more we can kind of frame that or think that, the more that we can grow in that space of that kind of paradox. And what would it mean to be better, per se, at seeing that, building that, creating spaces of thinking that? Those, I think, get into some sort of communal matters. Those are just some thoughts. I throw it back to you, Matthew.
And I think with what you're saying about this extracurricular movement of the subject. So the subject is this thing with form, this thing with efficient movement itself, this thing with a final destination, and this thing with a primordial disclosure. Well and good, but that's half the story, because this subject has an extracurricular.
Mm-hmm.
It has that orbit around it, which is room for it to grow. And one can saddle that and burden it with a lot of paradoxes that numb reception into that mode of effort taking. Or one can go to the other extreme and be so I don't know why the word hypoallergenic comes to mind, but can be so immune to any adverse activity from this porousness of the orbit of the subject that it will just pour whatever in and accept whatever comes out.
Yeah.
Hypoallergenic. Those two extremes of our hygienic response to possibility. So if the four causes are the subject the actual subject, the possibility around it, the extracurricular, which decides its freedom or is the freedom of its decision, that people can be repulsed by, or they can be fanboys and fangirls over. That is, the admiration can go too far, or the recession can be way too fast behind. People can be afraid of what they do not understand. And often what they do not understand is possibility. All right. And that leaves not a space of possibility, but a vacuum for demagoguery. Demagoguery in all its forms, which preys upon the passions stoked by imagination. So if we're not attending to the extracurricular of the subject, we might instead be attending through demagoguery or through manipulation or through pyrotechnics, the shadows on the wall of the flame of passions behind us that is steadily enraged. And therefore, we will not go on a plane and fly, or we will not go on a plane of suggestion that something affords to us because of some imagined cost. I'm not talking about money, but some imagined guilt trip. Now, reason I bring up that as segue is I was reading a book, which I bought, called The Analogy of Love. I forget the author, forgive me, but it's a contemporary author, teaches at, has taught at different places. He is a scholar that with other scholars have followed Saint Maximus the Confessor. He has had quite an upsurge in certain circles of the philosophy of religion because of the way in which he wrote and thought. Saint Maximus, some call a synthetic philosopher or theologian. That is to say, he can and is willing to bring together a lot of notions from different places and make a system out of them. But unlike Hegel, he doesn't let that, in my opinion, froth over the container, down away from it and say, well, the future will take care of what spilled over in the past that we don't know about, will take care of the spillover as well. You can agree that I've caught the distribution of written history from the Egyptians to Napoleon, you might say, something like that. Instead, Maximus will take different elements and he'll put it in between the ears, almost in a Joycean way, what the Christian goes through as the Christian behaves like a Christian. following the second command of loving your neighbor as yourself, almost like a day in Ulysses, you find yourself coming across the confluence of these notions that could not be sewed together in any other forecausal way than as a Christian would see it.
Mm.
And it doesn't mean the Christian, qua Christian, is stopping every 5 minutes and putting it together. But the phenomenology suggested by a day in the life is one that if you scale back and look at it from a helicopter, you would see the system of Saint Maximus, namely his logi and logos, the many and the one, which is shot through, may I say, with the life rafts of relation, not with monads in just the right spot at just the right time, with their windowless opacities that exist in faith. They are rather related in such a way that my person exists in the other through the action I give and take from the other. And that sounds highfalutin until I ask for something as simple as water from you. Then the language is a hypostatic energy of self-expression, self-denial, and self-reciprocity or self-seeing. The other witnesses my need, my lack, to use your word, and then gives that which is lacking, which is not a tree branch, not a cow, not a brick, not the molecular weight of water in words, but a glass of preferably cold water. And I use the example of giving a friend a cold cup of water to drink, A, because it's biblical, so it has more than one meaning, but also because in a fractal way, it shows us the way up. Maybe not the way down, but it shows us the way up. Maybe it also shows us the way down.
Well, it was interesting. I mean, I was just thinking as you were speaking, not to jump in.
Please.
It is interesting, like to think of the four call. Well, how are the four causes in operation in the gift? Like, what kind of emerges? Because it's interesting when we talk about the four causes. We usually talk about a thing. What is the efficient cause of the thing of the table? Its first cause and its final. But what does it mean if we start talking four causes of relation, or in a lack of water, or in a gift, right? It is very interesting because there's a lot of judgment that is going on, or kind of judging of the means, where the person wants water, and there's a certain idea that, okay, humans are that of which need water, so it would be fitting to give the person the water, because without water they're going to die. There's also a kind of understanding that the human has a certain form, where it's, say, different than a raccoon or this creature my daughter loves, the axolotl or whatever it's called. There's something where the human, the face in the Levinas way, is sort of causing a consideration of giving water that maybe you wouldn't do if it was a deer. You wouldn't think, I better get that deer water, right? You're like, well, the deer can get water. It can take care of itself, right? But with a human, there's something about the form and the notion that this is a human being that is given by the form, that is also shared in as a certain intelligibility that says, I ought to give water, right? I ought to bring the water. And also on this idea that, there was the first cause to arise to the situation, that water comes into existence, humans are that which need water, but then, of course, the cause and effect that is kind of brought to this moment of decision. And then, of course, there's a question of the final cause in the sense of, should humans actually, given what they are made to do and what they are, would it thus be right to give the human being water so that they can realize that final cause? But what's very interesting is all of that is this kind of held in the metaxis, as kind of Desmond, as Luber has been talking about, in that sort of space. And you almost, the four causes, what's very interesting is the four causes can't cause you to do anything. Like you then have to kind of step in as the agent in the gift which you decide to give or not in light of the four causes, or in light of form, efficient, final, and first, which then does speak to the subject as extracurricular, like this kind of orbiting of the four causes, where in the gift, the difference between the human being as a mere product of the four causes deterministically that they have no control of, as opposed to a certain sort of shepherd or kind of orbiting of the four causes, a certain sort of responsibility to adequately responding to how the four causes come together in this particular event, in this particular circumstances. Like that's what you're almost always judging the mean of, is the way that these things actually kind of intersect and come together as a decision, as a moment of I should give the water or I shouldn't give the water. And it is very interesting, as you're speaking of Maximus, on this idea that if we go through kind of the day in the life of Bloom or the day of the life of the Christian, that there is this kind of perpetual sort of decision of how you are making it. You're not just making a decision relative to the efficient calls or to the formal call. You're trying to actually keep them all together at the same time. Like this is a human being that is made in the image and likeness of God. This human being needs water. This is also the face of a human being that has some sort of ethical imperative to it. And also it is toward worship. And it would be kind of a betrayal of worship to deny this human being water. Therefore, you give the water. But it is interesting how you almost by definition then are making assessments that are geometrical. They are not just linear. They're not just algebraic following a single cause. And perhaps, well, it's almost like then when we talk about the four causes, the S is in parentheses. It is never just, it's the four calls. Like a singularity, a one in the many, right? And that as you're speaking with Maximus of the Logi and the Logos, it is bringing to mind how there is something about, again, the four causes that are actually the four causes with the S in parentheses. That is the four calls. And the Christian is it is critical for the Christian to become well attuned to the ability of keeping those together at all times, in all decisions, and maintaining them. And perhaps there are some and I'll give it to you. These are just thoughts. Temptations that arise that make it easy to overemphasize one or the other. I mean, obviously fear, Matthew 6, seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness is like, well, no, why don't we just make sure we have money, right? That would be utility. That would be effective. And we can say all day final calls, and we can say all day about what exactly we as human beings in the form of the image and likeness of God, Genesis 1:3, what that may compel of us, but the efficient cause wins. The practical concerns overtake it. Well, at the same time, there's a mistake of just saying, well, we shouldn't worry about money at all, right? Because then you're actually acting as if the four causes can be the three causes. And I guess the other critical point is that if the four causes are actually the four causes with the S in parentheses, you can never get rid of one of them without getting rid of all of them. And if you get rid of any of them and you get rid of all of them, then you're dealing with a lack of reality. You're dealing with a lack of substance, which, of course, the Christian is compelled to maintain full substance at all times, full holiness. But in speech, we can lose it. In community, we can lose it. In thought, we can lose it. And we actually have to maintain those, and it seems very difficult to do. But if we can, then you have created the space in which growth is possible. But then you're also not necessarily deciding what it means to grow. You are just creating the space by which growth can occur according to the Spirit. And you're supposed to almost trust that if you do these things, then growth will occur. That is outside of your power, but that doesn't mean you won't get the fruit from it. Those are just some thoughts. I'll give it back to you, Matthew.
Very good. I'm glad that you brought together in a single action or in a community of action the four causes. That is to say, you put the S in parentheses. This reminds me that as we're speaking of their extracurricular, as we're honing in on trust being invaluable to the cooperation with the Holy Spirit, God, as we are led to the truth. to quote Jesus in the Gospel of John. How we should, along the way, distinguish history, which can hold that S in parentheses, from our cause. We should distinguish history from tradition.
Mm.
And then we should subdivide or continue to distinguish history from tradition from memory. And to say, without splitting hairs or trying to split hairs, we should say that not one hair on the head of that reality, which includes all three, memory, tradition, and history, the head that include those realities, not one follicle of hair will be lost if that subject is patient, if that subject endures. Because at the end, it will be crowned with its reward. But if we're not careful, we might want to privilege one over the other. We might be too psychological and say, indeed, it is about a day in the life of a Christian. I'm a Christian, so let me study myself. Without remembering our Joyce, that in order to have a day in the life of Bloom, he had to have the whole surrounding in fine detail. So the modernist irony does not go unnoticed. In order to make this observer, they have to be well acquainted with what is not the observer.
Yeah.
And that's how the optical illusion is set. But one can be too psychological and privilege the memory over the tradition or over history. One can be too traditional and privilege that over our own memory or our own history. Or one can privilege the history over these rituals that bespeak a tradition. And one finds that if they begin privileging one over the other, you start to make the others caricatures of themselves. You start to bring a burning torch to a straw man.
Yeah.
And you come with what was not supposed to be a burning torch, the memory, and you make it one, because in your dialectic, it has to be the destroyer of the other two.
Yeah.
But neither is served. The memory that I'm making a weapon against my tradition, that the memory isn't served. It fights against me. But also the tradition is not served. It has to repel the memory. And then they look like they are in conflict. And on the ground, this can manifest itself by people speaking past one another, using public figures as hatchets against another person's stump, another person's 100-year-old. I forget what that tree is in California, those big tall trees. Sequoias,
Yeah.
not sequoias, but
Redwoods.
thank you. And sometimes our memory should stand in awe of the traditional redwood.
Yeah.
It might be good and healthy for the memory to stand so. History is something almost molecular, in my opinion. You can have people with different tools looking at subject matters from different angles,
Yeah.
and they'll write volumes on what kind of grease was used in the printing press. And sure, they open windows into something that otherwise would be airless, but you wonder why. I think history has a first cause problem, whereas tradition might have a final cause problem. And memory, while it's efficient seeming, it may, I mean, it seems by definition, it is amorphous. by report. It is amorphous. It is not formal. I mean, my memory is probably the most informal thing I have going for me.
Yeah.
The most informal thing I have going for me. And I think this ties back finally, and then I would like your opinion on those three modes that have not yet been crowned: the tradition, the history, and the memory. But not one follicle of hair will be lost from if we wait it out, not set them against one another like angry siblings. I want to say one thing about guilt trips. It seemed this book I've been reading, The Analogy of Love, he looks at the book After Virtue. You've been talking about
Yeah,
virtue.
McAllister. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, he looks at Kant's Kingdom of Ends and Kant's reinterpretation of the Golden Rule as some kind of elevator to the universal maxim that, well, if I can't know what matter really is, I can know what I ought to do, really. And what this author of The Analogy of Love claims through Saint Maximus is that the experience of guilt can be helpful, but for the last, say, 200 to 300 years, the West has so encultured or forgotten to take out of the refrigerator most of the life forms, and so they've grown a sort of little wilderness of moss
Mm.
around what the author of A Secular Age would call the buffered self, such that the individual in our world is so inadvertently well trained to be introspective that all they find with their newfangled hammer of conscience is how to harm themselves consciously, how to, in a monologue, find all the reasons, discover all the reasons rhetorically why they should feel guilty, why they are a bad person, why they do not measure up, why they are depraved, why they couldn't do that anyway because, why they have trauma. And they can even put in the language of memory or the language of tradition or the language of history. In either case, in any of those three cases, the selection bias is on how do I discover reasons for my guilt? When long before Kant and this grown introspection of there's the buffered self with its porousness that things can come in, but then there's the PORES, almost
Mm.
a spore of all these bad thoughts of why I'm a bad person, guilt, in other words, that has to somehow be, I need to be released of. Before all that, in the last, say, 300 years, what have I done immoral today? People navigated their, I won't say self-esteem, but their self-image by shame.
Yeah.
And what was the case, say, 1,000 years ago has been reversed today. So 1,000 years ago, shame was healthy.
Mm.
It could lead someone to grow. Nowadays, shame is seen as something that happens to people before they go to prison.
Right.
1,000 years ago, people would talk about guilt, and that's it's hard to say what people even thought about guilt. It wasn't discussed. It didn't have a lot of air to breathe and grow and spread its spores from. But nowadays, it's almost a virtue to signal one's guilt over something, because then you can receive the healing of the victim. A strange thing, because I have guilt since I perpetuated harm on a victim, speaking hypothetically, but by admitting that, I can now receive the healing of being understood as the victim of my own bad choice. It has its own dynamic nowadays because it's been allowed to grow so much. But what this author said in The Analogy of Love is The difference between shame and guilt, and again, not all guilt is bad guilt. I mean, some
Sure.
guilt makes us confess something we've done wrong and then we can be forgiven. So that's fine. It's just when it grows out of proportion. But in the past, shame was always something public, which meant it was
Yep.
always something experienced in community. And
Yep.
consequently, it was always buffered by
Hmm.
community.
Hmm.
Whereas
Hmm.
guilt, its internal loading bar, its internal buffer can't be the community. The
Right.
community can't feel guilt. Only individuals can, which may be one of the reasons why pre-printing press, pre-mass literacy, there wasn't such a great emphasis on guilt.
Hmm.
You could almost use a McEwen argument
Yeah.
of the
Oh, yeah.
media's message here. It, for some reason, the phenomenon of guilt doesn't happen in groups or crowds, but shame
Yeah.
does.
Hmm.
And therefore, in someone's growing ethical awareness of how to love their brother as they would love themselves, shame enters in as a potential and actual relation due to the fact that a person over time in a shame culture will ask of him or herself questions such as, if I don't show up there and do that thing today with the group, my absence will make more work for the others. And that's not good for the group. And it's also not good for me long term because they'll remember that. All of that is not bad calculation because its final end is the person showing up and contributing. But even if that person shows up, if they've been trained in guilt, even though they're keeping time, they're contributing, the group is healthy, they might have a monologue of, yeah, I'm doing it, but I'm still a bad person. Nothing's going to change the fact that I exist.
Right.
And it's sad to say, but that kind of guilt the group can't heal. In other words, if the group can't heal it, it must not be a good thing to even be there. It offers no signal for the
Hmm.
other.
Right.
And then you have to question I mean, the guilt's motive. And then you almost begin seeing it as something other than you, which can lead to an overemphasis in psychology and diagnose it as a problem. Or it can be someone too trained in Kant and going too, quote unquote, deep into moralism. But in any case, we find that there's more freight being given to the train of guilt than there is to the train of shame. So guilt and shame, what do you make of these with respect to the four blended cause in parentheses S and the health of a group?
Magnificent. I think those are very related. First, I'm going to make a move and say that when we successfully maintain the four causes as one, the many and the one with the S in parentheses, we get the beautiful. That a thing that is actually realized in harmony with its four causes actually becomes beautiful to us. And that now that's a move, but I think it's a critical move because when you see the thing as in light of its first cause, its origin, in its use, its work, almost like Adam in the garden, and then its form and its final cause, all of these come together in a certain harmony where we tend beautiful. That's beautiful. Like beauty and fittedness, that's fitted. Like it is there. So if you grant me the move from saying that when we successfully maintain the four causes or realize the four causes with the S in parentheses, that is an experience of the beautiful. I think from the
Granted,
granted, yeah, that we can then move to the question of guilt and shame, which is actually very important for this. And then, of course, the issue is if in human creations, in speaking, in art, etc., so forth, so with things that humans don't create, we have to realize the four causes, the F is S in parentheses. We have to realize the beauty and phenomenon. Whereas with things that humans create, we have to maintain them to ourselves as things of the four causes and then remember that, like realize them in there. There's something interesting in when humans create something, there's a certain sort of in the creation also realize, which I think is very difficult actually, because it's easier to talk about realizing something external from you, But to realize something you create, well, what do you mean? You know it, don't you? You made it. You know everything. What do you mean you need to realize something in something you create? But this is what all the great authors talk about. Like they talk about the novel as surprising them. They talk about creations as having lives of their own. Faulkner talks about Caddy as if she's his own person. And this I think is, I guess what I'm more kind of framing is there is a unique challenge of realizing the beautiful in something a human being creates, because there's some radical skillfulness to create it in such a manner that then it feels like it's not just yours. How does a human make something that then they experience as not just theirs? Well, great artists, they'll talk about the work as if the inspiration, it was from God, right? Like this also, I think, speaks to what it means for a human to grow. Is there's something about this capacity to make things that then feel like they're not just yours, and that you realize that additional excess in them, and yet you made it. That seems to be something the human is trying to grow into, and that the very reason we're able to grow is because whatever humans do, there's an excess. There's something apophatic. There's something extra. There's something beyond. Therefore, there's a space where even the thing we make, we can kind of grow into realizing what the thing is we made. Like that's what's very odd, is we don't actually know entirely what we're doing. Austin Farrell once said the genius is in the fingertips. It knows not what it does, describing Tolstoy. And I'm quite a fan of Austin Farrell. He was C.S. Lewis's teacher. He was an unspoken hero of the Inklings who wrote incredibly difficult to read books. Not good if for one's legacy if the books are impossible, but Finite in the Infinite is an important text. That all said, there is also something interesting where when we talk about growth, it seems as if growth is possible where we don't fall into one-sidedness. It's a Hegelian term, but one-sidedness, say, on the side of history at the expense of tradition, memory at the expense of tradition. So one-sidedness, meaning growth is possible where we don't fall into one-sidedness, but what this means is a mystery. What does it mean not to fall into one-sidedness? What do you mean maintaining history, tradition, and memory and not forgetting one or the other? How is that even possible? You can't think of everything at once, can you? Like, what does it mean to not fall into one-sidedness? And yet, I think the human can do it, and you know it in action. You can't think it, but you can do it. It's a tactile knowledge thing. Like, it's impossible to think not falling into one-sidedness, but it is possible to live not falling into one-sidedness by a perpetual maintaining of the mean, a perpetual judgment of the mean, a perpetual sort of cooking. Life as the chef, life is cooking. Oh, we need more history, we need more tradition, we need more memory, a little less memory. And so we can't think one-sidedness, but we can live it. But this, of course, is where then full body tactile knowledge, personal knowledge of Panier, all of this seems to be necessary for the question of what does it mean to grow. It would also suggest, I think, that one of the issues where if we forget the body for the mind grows into the body. Like the space in which the mind can grow is the body. And the space in which the body can grow is the earth. And the space in which the earth can grow into is God, etc., and so forth. The problem is I think a lot of modern man thinks growth in not the space in which growth occurs. And that we need to emphasize the situation and and then it's a first things first thing. I use it all the time. Lewis said, if you put first things first, you get second things also. But if you put second things first, you lose both. I think humans as caretakers of the garden, as shepherds, as we are supposed to focus on the space, openness, maintaining the space, and then the growth kind of takes care of itself, right? Because if you maintain, say, a belief in God, you create a certain space, a certain metaspace to reality, and if you take that seriously, that naturally inclines one to live in a certain manner where they grow because they're not thinking about the growth. They're simply thinking about worship, and that leads to a growth as simply what follows. When humans think about growth, they become Instagram influencers trying to talk about entrepreneurship or something, not to be mean. But it's so growth is possible where we don't fall into one-sidedness, but what that means is a mystery, but it is known in the doing. It is realized in the doing, and it is experienced. Because mystery, what is mystery to the mind, can be unfolded in the full lived experience, And of course, a mystery is that which the more you know, the more you find there's more to know. So it is ultimately mysterious, but mystery and unknowable are not similes. Unknown and unknowable are different. Something can be unknown, meaning there's always more to know. Unknowable means completely inaccessible. God is ultimately totally inaccessible, but that does not mean God cannot be accessed at all. He gives himself to be known, right? So there's a difference between God as unknowable and God as an unknown, where there is always more to know, right? And I think that also speaks to the kind of spaces humans need to make in church and family in their own life, in which then growth can occur, is spaces where there is that which there is always more to know, that whatever is known, there's still more. And I think basically something is beautiful, which again maintains the four causes with the S in parentheses. When you experience something as beautiful, you experience it as unknown, as that of which you can know and there's always more to know, and it's inviting you. It has a certain invitation. Just like a person is unknown, but that doesn't mean they're unknowable. That means there's always more to know. So if you successfully maintain a thing according to the four causes, S in parentheses, and therefore it is beautiful, it will have this certain quality of beckoning, this certain sort of drawing in. But this is where I think we get to guilt and shame. And also the triad, the history, the tradition, the memory is quite important, but I'll talk about guilt and shame. So guilt and shame is very interesting because you're exactly right. Guilt is individual, shame is communal. It would definitely seem, some people have done studies to show that, generally speaking, Western nations are guilt-based, Eastern nations are shame-based. Is where in the East people are far more concerned about shame, but there are ditches on either side of the road. Because in an Eastern society, if you can get away with it, then do it. Because there's no guilt, right? There's only shame. So you can get kind of corruption that, hey, if you don't get caught and your neighbor's okay with it, then don't worry about it, right? But then, so there can be shortcomings of shame without guilt, but then you've already described extremely well the shortcomings of guilt without shame, right? So there seems to be this critical ability to have both a certain guilt and shame that are tied together. But here's the issue. Without the beautiful, we don't know what to do with guilt. And we don't know how to think it with shame. And what I have in mind with that is Cardinal Newman is famous for talking about purgatory as basically taking a bath. And what he means by that is the problem is when you experience the glory of God, it's precisely because God is so glorious that you're like, I need to go to purgatory to clean off before I make it. It's not that God puts you in purgatory that Newman's just talking about. It's the idea that actually it would be like if someone the king showed up at your house and you were dirty. You just came out of the fields. You'd be like embarrassed and you'd be like, let me go clean off and then come back to the king, right? You would be you'd feel a certain shame. But notice that this shame, so this is the key. The way that Newman is describing shame, it is relational and it's tied to glory. It is not shame that's tied to a certain ethical, you stole something, so we're going to humiliate you. It's tied to glory, which is interesting because this kind of shame blends guilt and shame. It's individuated, but it's individuated in light of a relation that you want to rise up to. Right? It calls you out of yourself to present yourself in a better way, right? So the way Peter Kreeft talks it or Cardinal Newman is that you go and take a bath, right? The issue is that if you say, I have done bad things, therefore I'm unworthy, actually it should be more so, I have done bad things, so I must find beauty to kind of suffer the glory of its burning off. Like guilt is a feeling of a need for beauty. Because you need, like the guilt actually if you don't have beauty to burn the guilt off or to experience the glory that then summons and calls you to a certain virtue to be worthy of beauty, then you're just kind of stuck in the guilt. It doesn't go anywhere. And then inevitably it will become a trophy because that's the only way you're going to cope with it. Like it will become psychologically necessary to turn the guilt into a good thing because without beauty, you don't know what to do with it. But if you have beauty, Then the idea is I have guilt because guilt is tied to a certain unworthiness, right? I'm unworthy, right? Well, if you say, well, first off, we're all unworthy because we're not as beautiful as we could be and we're not as beautiful as God. That's why we got to work at virtue. That's why we got to get better. The guilt has a certain motion to it in light of beauty. It's not just stagnant. It's like, okay, I need to actually go gain virtue. And then also the feeling of beauty where it torture, there can also be a kind of torture to the guilt. But the key is that the torture that is experienced in beauty is burning the guilt away. This is the key. Like when you have guilt without beauty, you feel the torture of the guilt, but it never goes away. It's just stuck in it, right? But in beauty, when like what Cardinal Newman is getting at, when you experience beauty, the pain you feel of being unworthy of it is transforming you. Like when you experience beauty, you are attracted to it and you become more virtuous, actually. You work toward it. So the burning you feel of guilt is actually burning off. It is actually going away. But without beauty, then you can't have a guilt that burns off. It just stays on you forever, and it doesn't improve you, right? So what ends up happening is what we have now are doctrines of guilt and shame that in lacking beauty, you can't get what I would call the sublation of those things, which is a certain sort of, wow, I'm not glorious, but I'm experienced the glorious, which then attracts me to it to be more like it. And then the pain I'm feeling in guilt is actually working toward that very virtue because you're attracted into it, right? And also the beauty is inviting. It's not judging you. This is also critical. It's not like the beauty is like actively saying you're a terrible person. The beauty is just being itself, and you are judging yourself as having done bad things, which then is compelling you to do better, to improve, to actually get closer to the beautiful, because you can't experience the beautiful without at the same time it wooing you to want to be closer toward it, right? But all of this is only possible. So I'll give it to you. But so basically,
this is good.
If
As
we
long as you
can't,
want, my friend.
you're kind. So if you can't judge the four causes, then things can't disclose themselves as beautiful, which means you cannot experience that of which can burn off guilt toward the virtuous. So then what ends up happening is guilt gets sort of stuck in itself, which then can become egotistical and you're stuck in, or you can't have a communal shame that is driving people because it's bound by the relation, but that is bound toward the beautiful, toward the ability to attend to the world in a new way. Well, then the shame will itself be gamified because if I can get away with it, it's okay. So shame corrupts, but then guilt corrupts without the beautiful because then it becomes that individual affliction, as Simone Weil would say, that's sort of trapped in this self-enclosure. So you have to have the beautiful. You have to have this experience of that of which is calling you out of yourself. But that would require the ability to apprehend things according to the four causes with the S in parentheses. So basically then, without this attention, this Simone Weil attention, I don't think you can actually, it's almost then the ethical is necessarily just going to be corrupt. Like the ethical itself will be corrupted. Like that's the weird thing. Like even ethical things become corrupted, right? Like they become gamified. They become their own forms of entrapment. Honesty becomes transparency by which the government controls you. Kindness becomes something where you allow injustice because you don't stand up against it, right? Like you can think of every single virtue without the beatific or brought together and say the person of Jesus actually having an entrapped form of it because it can't burn off its excess to fit in harmony with other virtues. So I'll give to you, but that also to me suggests what it means to grow. The very fact that growth is even, because there's two ways to also take that. What does it mean that growth is possible? Would suggest that we're dealing with a reality of trying to harmonize parts that have to be kept together. They don't always go together. Like there's a movement in space itself. Like reality itself has a certain motion in it and under it. And that's why growth is possible because is always possible because every moment is a new opportunity to think that harmonization or to think those pieces together. And there is always a new way to think the thing because there is an infinite creativity latent in every single moment, right? So the possibility of growth speaks to the ever possibility of thinking all of these parts together. And also, growth is always possible because there's a beauty that is unknown, but there's always more to know. That's why it's unknown. It is not unknowable. So growth is always possible because there is always a principle of beauty that there is always more that can be known of. And then if in the process of knowing that beauty, the subject is changed, then growth occurs. So growth is always possible because there is this latency in reality. And then that latency affords growth occurring in light of that beauty, of which is contingent upon the capacity to attend to reality according to the four causes, was the S in parentheses, which then rightly orders or rightly situates the virtues and keeps things like guilt from entrapping or shame from becoming an entrapment. Those are some thoughts, but I give it to you.
Thank you for bringing up beauty and its attractive quality. It's a gentle, agental with the space between the A and the G, but also the agental with the IAL at the end, mode of it's inviting. The movie The Beauty and the Beast, and in that movie, the depiction of the flower underneath the glass container, it seems worthy of a remark that shame, guilt, and the beautiful, and I want to echo Saint Maximus here, and I want to bring up Saint John Chrysostom in a few minutes, but before I do, shame, guilt, and beauty are verbal, are verbs. They are doings, they are movements. They are not things. They're runnings, they're walkings, they're believings, but they're not things. So I can't put shame underneath the glass container of nomenclature and in a taxonomy and expect it not to, like a butterfly, hit against the sides until it casts it to the side and flies away from the shards. Shame will do that. Guilt will do that, except it will perform a Houdini and disappear.
Right.
It will become smaller,
Right.
more insinuating into the finer clefts of consciousness. And there it will become dark and hard and dense. Beauty under such constriction, I can't imagine. I mean, that would be the short story writer, his name escapes me, who collected butterflies and put them behind glass with pins in their wings. I forget his name.
Nabokov.
Yeah, thank you. We don't look at candy with our eyes. We look at it with our tongue, right? So they're not behaving thingly. So we give up the effort to put them in a glass container and instead liberate our analysis to go with them. Shame then would have a movement, guilt would have a movement, and so would the beautiful. And I think you already put your finger on the movement of the beautiful. It is one of invitation, which is a call begging a response. And as you also said, shame can be this thing that receives the call to come closer. And knowing, in the sense of intimacy, being quite aware, quite familiar with, quite close to its own smallness, it bravely steps forward. But on the other hand, how can it be said to bravely step forward if it's simply accepting the call to come closer? And that second diminution itself is a grace because it feeds the healthy shame, it feeds the humility, which then can receive more callings for greater closeness. And if someone is tempted to put that under a glass container of analysis, they'll find that it disappears rather quickly. You can only see that more humility means greater exaltation if you do it. You can't think that formula beyond a sentence. One sentence will do just fine. I don't need to keep repeating myself, but the experience will repeat itself in manifold novel ways. And you can't know that, you can believe that, and the proof of the belief is the work. Faith and works here. But faith and works in the context of humility does not become entrepreneurial. So let's say a person's not in a buffered or a non-buffered self-image. That is to say, they are completely doused in relation. Wherever they turn, they're in relation, whatever they think it is in relation. And let's say, for the sake of supposal, that's everybody anyway. But let's say someone becomes acutely aware of being doused in relation from all sides. I don't think it would solve a single problem. It wouldn't make life easier. It just would allow them to live a life that is well fitted for their existence. And someone might say, well, that is the meaning of all the problems anyway. That's the solution to all the problems anyway, even those I'm not aware of. Fine. But the only way to accept, to claim that is true, is to believe it is true. You can't know it by reasoning.
Right.
You can't know by reasoning you are in a state of fittedness hypothetically. It can only be if you are in the state. And if one is not there yet, but they believe they're on the path, it's quite similar. And I don't think you can know that inside yourself. I think you have to know that inside yourself in relation to the other. I don't think there's any other way around yourself than through the other. And I think the more one talks in a relational frame, the less they're going to make sense to a person who speaks with a different frame. And maybe that's one of the things we can bring out. And so my question to you is that what our tradition is for? Is that what loving God with all our heart, mind, soul, and strength, and our neighbor as ourself means? Is that why there is extra space? Is that the efficiency of my hands and feet and the ears that are open to hear the good news? The answer seems to be yes, but so often we're not rewarded for what we give our assent to. It's what we do that we are rewarded for. And there's this knee-jerk reaction to want to be an impulsive ego and do something radical right away. But that is shameless. And it's entrepreneurial in the sense of assuming I'm not doused with relation on all sides, then I'm just this buffered self that has the luxury to ask myself, well, since the ground has been so fruitful for me, I can take time to build a barn to store it all. That is to say, I can decide what to do with my life. I want to decide how I'm going to expend my resources and deploy my talents. What will I give to the world by my free choice? And when will I allow the world to receive it? And in what form? And how quickly? And to what end? For how long? That question seems to be entrepreneurial, and it's very American. As Ralph Waldo Emerson said, the American is the one darting to an aim. It seems to be also repugnant because it's easily made fun of, and especially nowadays with mass marketing, it is endlessly made fun of. Oh, you have a scheme to sell water. So what's your brand going to be on this bottle, plastic bottle of water? Well, it's going to be this long story and this catchy name and these scientific facts about purification. That will do the trick. And I'm very passionate about it. So I'm going to give talks on this product. You mean water? Yes, yeah, but the product. Water. Yes, but you see where I'm coming from. Oh, I see exactly where you're coming from. This we're suspicious of entrepreneurs on some deep level, as you intimated with the social media example. But people doused in relation, I don't think we're so suspicious of. We might be quite ignorant of because they're rare, right? They are saints, we say.
Yeah.
Saints are not geniuses. They may be, but certainly they are illumined. And
Right.
they are capable of praying for the whole world, which must mean that they are not afraid of being there for the world. So I think what I'm trying to say with those two things is someone surrounded by relation versus the person who's entrepreneurial with what they're going to bring out of themselves for others to see at the appointed time.
I think that is tremendous framing. And very well said. Um, so first off, I do think there is something about tradition that gets you outside of yourself. So much of the name of the game seems to be getting you outside of yourself, to actually believe that there is something beyond you. So some sort of maintaining of openness seems to be very important. Cleo Kearns, who I enjoy speaking with, she was talking about disenclosure, how the Christian life is tied to this disenclosure, and we have to work against enclosure, right? But of course, if you have no enclosure at all, it's chaos, there's no structure. So how do you have a kind of disenclosure? So a circle with a little opening in it, right? Enough of a circle, you say, oh, that's a circle, but when you look, it's like, actually, no, there's an opening in it. So is it a circle? It's an open circle. Well, that's interesting. How do you open the circle enough that it maintains the form of circle? Well, this is very interesting because you're suggesting that something could fail to be a circle and yet still have the form of circle, and in that kind of openness actually turn into something new and afford a world beyond itself, you could say, and relations. So this disenclosure question, I think, is very powerful. I think also, so on this kind of idea of faith works humility, there's also something about the one who gets in memory, where memory at the expense of tradition, that could be a lack of humility because there's nothing I need to know beyond memory. I don't need to know a tradition or hold to a tradition. But then there could also be someone who holds to tradition who's scared of memory. They're scared of their self, so they're just going to hold to the tradition and not think themselves. And then, of course, there can be the one who gets into their ultra specialized history where they're doing a whole lot of work to write a very specialized dissertation, but it lacks any faith. And it lacks any humility because now they're the world expert on the oil used in the Gutenberg press, right? So there's something about those three that there's a one-sidedness that is possible. And the question, of course, would be how does one know if they're maintaining the three together, right? Because there's some sort of idea that there is to, I suppose, the Benedict monk, a sense where they're doing a kind of quiet, specialized work like the historian, but they're doing it in light of a tradition, and also they're an individual on the side of the road on the trade routes who are doing this work. So there's something about doing a work that has that kind of thinkless work, because there is, there's something to be said about the scientist or the historian who is gathering all this small data thinklessly in the lab. Nobody really appreciates it, and yet because of them we have data that helps us do studies we otherwise could not. So there's something about the one who's doing the radically specialized work that is pretty remarkable in its thanklessness. They're not coming up, some of these researchers are resisting the temptation for grandiose claims to do thankless work gathering data, and there's something very noble about that. But then there's something very dangerous about that, in that you lose sight of the big picture. So there's something about history, because there's also, I guess what I'm thinking is that there's something about the individual doing quiet work, gathering, that sees themselves as, in a way, making history, which sounds odd because we tend to associate making history with this big thing. You're going to make history, but there's something about, no, history is slowly made, one piece of the data at a time, one copy of the book, one sort of slow gathering things together that is making history. And that is not always appreciated. Like, history is made by this kind of slow, gradual work, right? But there's also an idea where that making of history in this small way is ignoring tradition. How is it fitting in the tradition? How is it fitting in, are you losing sight of individual, like the memory, et cetera, right? So you have to maintain these three things all together at the same time. And that's not necessarily easy. But then the question is, like, what are the kind of signs that you're actually doing it, right? What is the kind of evidence that it is going on? Because I think this is, again, another example where beauty comes in. Because if you ask yourself, am I doing a good job? Oh, well, if I'm doing a good job, then I must be getting the balance between history, tradition, and memory. But the problem is, the specialist who's doing a good job is gathering a bunch of small pieces and they're losing the tradition. Or the someone who, am I doing a good job in terms of memory, in my own personal sort of experience, where you could be losing the history and the tradition, right? So asking questions of, am I doing a good job? Or if you ask, well, is it true? Am I getting to the truth? This could be problematic, because you could say, well, I need to get even more specialized information and I lose the big picture. But if you ask, is there the beautiful, and we mean it as the strike of beauty, as Jockin will talk about, what's very interesting is that resists losing one of the three for one. Because the beautiful suspends you, it exists outside of you. And what Jockin and I will talk about a lot is how the beautiful contains the true and the good, but you can focus on the good at the expense of the beautiful and then lose them all, right? Because what ends up happening is when you lose the beautiful, you start describing good in terms of pragmatism and utility. That's the problem. Like, good has to be toward the beautiful. And then it subsumes it. It kind of nests it together. And then that would mean is that one, in their humility, is looking for glimpses and glimmers of the beautiful. These moments of these sort of things breaking through, I would associate that with Holy Spirit. These moments of things coming forth that are kind of signposts. Often Jesus's miracles are referred to as kind of signposts. They're not just kind of magic tricks. They're but they're pointing to what is to come, right? They have this kind of signpost structure to it. Well, so it goes with the beautiful. It is pointing toward the way that you need to go. Because if you ask, am I maintaining all of the things together? Am I maintaining the four causes as the cause? Well, then you're bringing it into your own power and rationality, and you're probably going to break them apart, because by definition, the rational slices up, right? So you actually have to be following signposts and kind of trusting in those signposts, right? And the beautiful these moments of beauty tend to be signposts of, this is the way. You can't know it. It can be scary and you want to look over your shoulder, but then Lot's wife turns to dust, or you look down in Peter and sing into the water. So there's something about the beautiful that is the thing that you trust, that these experiences of the beautiful are actually signposts of the maintaining. But there's always this wondering, am I? Maybe I'm not, but that thing keeps it out of your power and keeps it in humility. So it seems like it has to be that way or else it's going to fall into human capacities that could be problematic. But then, of course, on this idea of the kind of entrepreneurial versus the relational, I think then how does one maintain in life a sort of idea of, okay, what is it to grow in a manner that is actually going to, dare I say, be Christian, in a manner maintaining the beautiful, versus a kind of entrepreneurial, not that entrepreneurship is bad, but this kind of entrepreneurial that is looking for opportunity, or when am I going to give the world my capacities? What I think about a lot is action that doesn't have guarantee, because there's a certain active patience, right? Like, so for example, there is no guarantee, and I really do think so much of what we're supposed to do has something to do with space making. And I know I've been saying that a lot, but these making of spaces, because there's something about God that is time and temporal, and space is in which time passes. Like, we create temples, we create spaces in which kind of spirit moves through, and we're really trying to create sort of containers. But containers that are like the open circle, not to contain, but it's sort of like a ritual, a holy space, really. I really think humans are really, a lot of what we're supposed to do is creating these kind of holy spaces. Like a home, it could be a work, it could be a church, but like even the ability to just, when you walk and meet someone, create a certain presence, right? Like, not, you don't have an agenda, but just a certain kind of field, a kind of experience that kind of is afforded when they come into certain places, which then kind of feels like God passes through here, or this is kind of the place that God kind of comes through, right? The reason why I emphasize space making is because right there, that's relational, where if we talk about objects or products, it's going to be entrepreneurship and you design it. But when you're making a space, there's no guarantee. You know, if you make a temple, well, God might come, he might not, right? You know, you have this sort of design, could work or it might not. It's just like, well, to make it more concrete, it's like when you write a story or you write a poem, you can pour so much time into it and yet it not have the impact on the reader you want it to have. And then you spend another 10 years on it and it still doesn't, right? Like, there's this radical humility you experience when you create something like a short story, because you realize, I thought it was right, I thought it was perfect, and you really are trying to create almost a space that the reader occupies, an emotional space that hits them, and you realize that it's not clear how to do it, and yet there is a right and wrong, and you keep working at it, finding the sentence, and you're trying to make something, but then if you capture it in one story, you may never capture it again. So there's a fundamental kind of humility to it, but it's radically active, but also patient. And this is what is interesting to me. There is something about the work I think we're supposed to do that is this patient activity that is that's tied to a lack of guarantee, but is that lack of the guarantee that makes it possible to be a certain space of a certain Holy Spirit experience, or an experience of the beautiful. And it's tied to design. And like, I think too, like relations, you don't know where a relation is going to go. You don't know what the outcome of a relationship is going to be. You could be entirely, quote unquote, wasting your time, because you could spend 5 years in a friendship and then one day they get angry at you, or they make their own. Well, maybe they just make a personal decision that makes them face consequence. There's nothing you can do. And it's not that you did anything wrong. It's just that they made a decision. You're vulnerable to that, right? That seems to be the kind of work we're talking here, is where there are no guarantees, and yet it requires actual work. And you have to be patient, in the sense of, you have to be patient with when that happens. You pour 5 months, you don't give up. You have to be patient with the process of 50 years. You have to be patient with how relations unfold and how they go in different ways, and how someone then has a short temper or you have a short temper, but there's a radical activity. It's not passive, but it's also patient dealing with relations. I'm going to pause and give it to you. This is what I'm thinking here, is this very interesting, when you're talking about prioritizing relation, I associate that with space making, creating certain spaces. and it lacks guarantee. It requires patience and it doesn't have guarantee. And this seems to be how a human can do work that doesn't fall into the problematic entrepreneurial mindset. And it seems incredibly important because without it, it doesn't seem like we have spaces in which can train our capacity to judge the mean, ergo the four causes with the S in parentheses, to experience the beautiful. And if we cannot do that, then it is only a matter of time before shame and guilt get us and we can't burn it off and we become entrapped, right? Like this space making seems to be what people need to enter so they don't end up in various entrapments of various forms, that they're actually able to taste what is possible with openness, that is possible outside of entrapment, and to then believe it is possible, because if they can experience here, then they know it's possible because it happened here. So it could happen elsewhere, and maybe they could design it too and do it in different ways. And that then creates a certain spread that becomes possible, not scale as in taking over things, but a certain spread. I make distinctions between spread and scale. And that work of spread seems to be very important. I will pause there and give it to you on any thoughts on anything.
Spread is quite good in this regard. Two images come to mind based on that and based on the preceding remarks you made. The image of a dish of ice cream with a spoon in it, and then the image of a chessboard. And to involve your concept of space through which time passes, I would propose we can see our objects now as spatially extended and not in the way of space. So what do I mean? It seems to me that the space of the dish of ice cream with a spoon in it behaves differently than the space of the chessboard.
Wow.
And this isn't something I can describe too well. I can't, through projective geometry, take the properties of the space in which the dish of ice cream with a spoon in it exists and put some of those properties on a screen and claim that some of those properties are preserved in this other format, like I could with projective geometry by saying, well, this circle on 2 dimensions captures something of the idea of a sphere. Sure, if I want to say the scoops of ice cream are in globs that look like spheres and I put a circle on the board, I've captured one of the properties of that dish of ice cream, but I haven't, because it's not a sphere. It's a scoop of ice cream. And it's melting, or it's becoming less icy. I don't know that, I can't say that and persuade you of that too well, but if you sit down in front of it, you become acclimated to that space. You become an understanding being with respect to, it's ice cream. I should eat it sooner than later. Otherwise, I won't be able to. Or someone made this. Wow, it is a dessert. Did they already eat? Now, if a computer was overhearing me, they might say, he's in front of food asking if they already ate. That sounds like a contradiction. Because if they already ate, it wouldn't be there. It would have to be told ice cream falls under dessert and dessert comes after the main meal. And therefore, he's really talking about the difference between desserts and main meal, which really he's talking about a successor function, like an antecedent. That's addition. It wouldn't see the ice cream dish. It wouldn't see the space. It wouldn't see it all.
Right.
So I can't really tell you what that space consists of. But if you sit in front of it, you'll get an idea. You'll be affected.
Right.
You'll start to act semi-accordingly. If you sit, and this I think is even more pronounced, if you sit at a chessboard, and it's almost so pronounced that it's bottlenecked, and you feel that you have to do something if someone occupies the space opposite you on the chessboard. And goodness sakes, if we put a clock beside the board between the two of you, we're accentuating that space. We're not changing it. We're accentuating what already is there. And now I want to move pieces if I'm an amateur. I just like, they got to move. Whereas the other person is calculating. I wouldn't do these things in front of an ice cream dish. Why? Is it because I think like a computer? Dessert comes after a main meal, and this is instantiated after a main meal. And I'm asking if they already ate because I showed up and there's an ice cream dish here. That means I missed the main meal. That means I'm late. That means they probably think I'm impolite. All of that neuroticism, maybe a computer can nest the functions of, but I'm not seeing the ice. I mean, people don't think, describing that to you really isn't going to give you the sense and frame of mind that you would have if you're sitting there. So, and even though we have powerful computers that calculate ahead of time the best chess move, the computer doesn't see the board. And so it's not interacting with the space that is the chessboard. It will never have tension in its left eyebrow because it's in competition. Right? The space of the dish of the ice cream never puts you in a frame of mind for competition, but the chessboard will. So maybe this is how we can have our cake and eat it too. This is how we can have our object and our space. If we put space as prior to the object, as a matter of concern, then things are spatially extended, and as spatially extended, we can't help but operate differently depending on the space. And we can't know that ahead of time, ahead of experience. And so we can't rely always on what the computer says it is. This is one of the reasons why we won't be able to automate our decisions up to the last judgment and say, I'm sorry, but the computer told me to do it. Because we'll be judged for the things we can see.
Yeah.
I was thirsty and you gave me nothing to drink. Mm-hmm. We won't be judged for the things we can't see. That is to say, the things we cannot believe. It seems to me. And in that regard, we could talk about the parables, but I want to come to St. John Chrysostom, because as I read him, there's one thing a commentator said about him, which I agree with, based on his homilies and commentary on the scriptures. A Greek word, sin, not S-I-N, but S-Y-N, katabasis, sin katabasis. Together, according to the basis. So we have an idea of a basis, a premise, a foundation. We generally have an understanding of what it means to be according to, language of relation. Could be abstract, could be concrete. But what I want to focus on is that together. One translator in the Latin translated that word sin katabasis as considerateness. So how do we avoid being one-sided when it seems to involve an impossibility, not just an improbability, getting outside ourselves, that is, to stand before the face of beauty and say, as St. Peter did at the Mount of Transfiguration, it is good for us to be here. Considerateness, sin katabasis, St. John Chrysostom used as his hermeneutical guide or lamp or light or principle for interpreting the scriptures. He said, in other words, that it's written the way it's written because God is considerate of us. He speaks to us in a way that we can see and hear and taste and touch and respond to. Not as if we were angels, as if we were without bodies, but as we are with bodies. And I find that to be so helpful because it means that he's not trying to pull our leg. He's trying to help our legs. And maybe that's what spatially extended objects do. They help us be in the world. They're not asking us to be phenomenologists, that is part of a specialty class, but they're asking us to be attentive and often, if not always, confine ourselves to ourselves. And that's what humility is, coming back to ourselves. Because when we come back to ourselves, we come back to our memories, not another person's inserted memory. What saved the prodigal son was not that he ran away from the swine, but that when he was standing there feeding the swine, he came to himself. And when he came to himself, he could remember his father's house and the food. And on that basis, make the decision to go home and leave the swine. It's not just that he had the wherewithal to say, swine are bad, I'm not bad, so I'm going to run away from the swine. That was the mistake the Pharisees had made. Oh, he receives sinners. They're bad. They were semi-outside themselves, so they couldn't remember where they were supposed to be going and where they were supposed to be, where their finger wasn't supposed to be pointing. The circle with the space I like because it allows for what you've said, and I apologize, I haven't been able to adequately react to. Failure helps us struggle, and it helps us ask for help. And in the asking for help, we come closer to the one we love asking for help. I think that's one of the things Disneyfied, sentimental, Hallmark, heartbreaking romance stories forget is that love is simple sometimes. It is asking for water and receiving it. And it doesn't partake of the convenience store where I go and within minutes I get what I want. That's where your patient endurance, I think, comes in. When we're dealing with the other, we're not dealing with certainties or guarantees that if I press the button and ask the question, I get what I want. It takes some courage and humility, the humility of courage or the courage of humility to ask another person for something I don't want to do without, which shows my weakness. And I can't control how they're going to think. I can't control what they're going to do. And the second stage of that is receiving what they give. And my goodness, Daniel, it seems as if when we outline it this way, who would want, it sounds like every day is drudgery then. So impossible, so much work, so hard. But I think one of the great proofs of God, his love for us, is that when we try, he helps us try and gives us energy. That calmness, when it should not be there, it's God.
I mean, for me, that's very well put. And one of the great mysteries is that this very activity, like you say, that sounds like drudgery and overwhelming, actually brings with it this peace that passeth understanding, right? That it brings this sele. And that actually then it is integrated in toward a certain habit and joy that then actually, well, to me, it kind of proves grace. Because if it wasn't, if it wasn't, in a sense, if it was easy or it wasn't drudgery, then you would say, well, of course, it's just man's power. But the fact that in the doing of it, it has this ability to create this energy in of itself, you could say this motivation in of itself suggests a movement of grace and different things. And no, my friend, it is very late, and I apologize for my internet situation being so bad with the cell data. I will anyway have to probably go to make sure the file isn't so big that it destroys the cell data. I don't know where the time goes. I enjoyed so much, but a few more things though. I think
Yes.
a very key piece. I really like this considerateness that you are framing. I think this is very powerful, and actually is a term that I think is getting at it. What you were saying about the ice cream and the chessboard. This is very important. Different spaces call us into different action. Different spaces draw out of us different modes. And if there's something about the human that is tied to space making, it is tied to creating different spaces that draw something different out of people. And what is drawn out of people then is not reducible to our own plans and intentions. All you can do is create the environment where this thing can come out. I've also been thinking more and more, I guess, about space because we've talked about it before. I favor the models of time space, not space time. I don't think time is an illusion and space is absolutely like in an Einsteinian block universe. I think that space is a manifestation of time and that time is actually more fundamental than space in a kind of Bergsonian sort of way. But the reason why this is important is
Duration.
because, yeah, duration, exactly. So then space is a manifestation of time, but this is very interesting because in a sense, space is a creative act then. Like space is, like you're saying, this kind of objects are extensions of space almost to make time intelligible. You could say that space is the consideration of time. Like time is being
Haha.
considerate through space, really, right? And so likewise, if space is in a sense a sort of creative invitation of time, then humans as space makers kind of makes sense, and as that's kind of the creative act that we can do. We tend the garden. We create spaces that are manifestations of time that are affording different actions. So then what humans are really kind of supposed to be doing is working in a manner to make experiences of consideration, where it feels like time is considerate, where we're able to consider one another. And there's a certain way in which then we consider the birds of the air. We consider the lilies of the field. We're trying to habituate one another into consideration and to make reality feel considerate, to make time feel considerate. And we're creating spaces of which then create the actions of consideration that is a response to feeling considered, which then naturally is an open circle because you're considering something beyond the immediate horizon. The moment you're talking consideration, you're talking an open circle versus a closed circle, because you're talking about something beyond it. So I think I just wanted to say, to me, that emphasis on consideration, like God is considerate. Like reality creation is presenting itself in a manner that is considering us. It's not trying to make us something we are not, right? It's considering us, but it's considering us so that we might be afforded the experiences of beauty, so that we might be brought to God. It's meeting us to come to Him. So likewise, we need to make spaces that feel the people around us are considered so that they can come into relation with us and one another. So it's kind of ethics as consideration. Like the ethical relate, there's something about consideration that seems to be the characteristic of ethics as relation that are taking seriously space making as affording different actions, and then spreading those conditions of possibility. So I just wanted to say I really appreciate. I've not thought of that term. I'm not familiar with that, but that seems very important.
And if I could
Consideration.
say in
Please,
quick
please.
response, because I want to preserve the data, like you said, the that reminds me, you're putting time before space. The the parable Jesus gives of the ungrateful servant.
Mm.
This brings us perhaps full circle with an opening for the future. The king or the Lord notices or forgives one of the servants an inordinate, huge magnitude debt. But let's not think of that in terms of space. Where is the pile of money? Let's use your phrase, your turn of phrase. Let's think of that magnitude as time. An amount owed that there would not be time enough, or what is the same thing, would involve all the time the servant has. Complete servitude. If that servant was going to try and discharge that debt, he would become a redundancy. He already is the servant. But if he was going to try and discharge all the debt, he would be a double servant. Do you see what I'm trying to say?
Right.
Because not only is he a servant as role in relation to this Lord, but by trying to discharge all the debt that he owes the Lord, it would require all his time. But in one sense, all his time is already given to the Lord via his role of being a servant. But now that he's going to try and give all the debt, all his time is going to be spent in service, here's the key, to that problem.
Mm-hmm.
And that will, ironically, distract him from serving the king.
Right.
In terms of time, now the king forgives him the debt. That is to say, all the time that you owe me through that thing of bringing that thing to me, that time, I say, is no longer your time. You have no relation to it anymore. But here's the kicker. Do you accept the gift of forgiveness? Or is that too much? And it is perceived as far easier to take back the debt.
Right.
Because it seems easier to put all my time in giving to the Lord what is his. But the Lord has said, I don't want that to be your time. I forgive you of that time. Instead, use your time. How? Enter the next part of the parable. They're so beautiful, aren't they? I'm using your word beautiful. He comes to his fellow servant who owes him. And if we think of debt not just as, well, it's a smaller pile of coins. It's probably under some boot or in some closet. Where is he hiding it? We could convert one of those idols or one of those pillars or that nice fancy glass window. We could convert that into piles of coins. But that's to put space in front of time. If we put time in front of space, then it's a smaller piece of time that this servant owes him. And that servant says to him, give me time and I will pay you back. Give me time and I will use the time you give me to give you the time that is owed to you. He could have said, okay. But instead, what he said was, he spoke with immediate action, constricting the throat that could ask for more time and the same throat that could curse. He was taking time out of the body, killing, strangling, yelling at him with a flat guilt trip. Pay me what you owe, as he's taking the time of life from him. You see, it's a poetic image.
Yeah.
He's taking the time of life from him as he's screaming at him to give him more time. Give him the time that he owes as he's taking the life from him. Who does that sound like in the Old Testament? Pharaoh, to the Egyptians. Lazy, lazy, make more bricks, double the quota. But we don't have time to do the original one. Now you're doubling it. Where will we find the time to do what you're asking from us? He's being oppressed. And that servant tells another servant, makes its way back to the king, who says, "You wicked slave. I forgave you, redirected your time. You should have redirected the other person's time. But since you didn't, you're going to pay everything you owed." In other words, because it's not just a pile of cash that can go poof, the time can come back, which already was there, and now it's in prison. So this idea of time as prior to object, this duration explains a lot about how people can suffer in the same place that another person feels blessed in. Long-winded, forgive me.
No.
Final word is yours. Final word.
No, I think that's exactly right. Well, again, for me, time in that double possibility that you're describing, again, I can't help but bring up beauty. Experiences of beauty can be both wonder but also hatred. An experience of beauty can be strike and make you feel miserable because it's so wonderful, but it also can attract you in. Like God can be held to those who hate him, right? Like this sort of doubleness that is possible based on your stance and the way that you hold yourself toward is kind of transforms the same thing in different ways, right? And so this way in which time can unfold, or how we're taking time for one another, or we're kind of ironically taking the time that somebody owes us in the name of getting that time, because what we want is a kind of affordance of a certain space. It's not just merely like money or objects, but we want a certain extension in the world. We want a certain way of being that as we take it from others as we demand it of them. And that sort of suggests why, like often debts, like when you demand a debt of someone, what we want from debts is a certain ultimate kind of experience of sort of time and relationality, that the very demand of debt destroys the condition of that possibility of that relationality. And that is also why when God, it's very interesting because on this idea of kind of God forgiving debts, it's the opening of time. Like now time can move into kairos also. It kind of like on this idea of when you go, well, isn't it kind of unjust for God to, because there's always this idea, like if people did terrible things and God forgives them, isn't that kind of unjust? Isn't there something unjust about forgiveness? And of course you have God lays down his life and all these different things, etc., so forth. But there's almost a way in which the suggestion of it is that, well, actually what debt is getting, that you're removing debt, you want time from people, that the very demand of that time then removes the thing you want. Like it has this self-consuming logic to it, right? It's like, you know, the reason we're forgiving debts is because if debts exist, there is an openness, and ultimately what we want is this openness. We want this openness of time. And so the removal of debts is for actually the gaining of what the debts are wanted to get. Like we want the debts to have the ability to open our world, to have money, to do what we want to do, to kind of have a certain power and status, to have a certain control over things, actually. But ultimately, these are all idolatries. These are not actually what we seek. What we seek is a certain openness to reality, a certain quality of time, a certain quality of experience that is more like the beautiful, that the logic of debt actually get in the way of. So the removal of debts is for the sake of the person to whom the debts are owed, because the person for whom the debts are owed is actually by those very debts kept from an experience of reality that actually is rich, you know, in a sense, that there's a richness to reality when time is kairotic, when it is open in this way. And so the forgiveness of debt is actually for the very ends of which debt are for. There's a way in which the debts that God forgive are debts in which the four causes are blown apart. Like you're actually losing the four causes. You're sacrificing the final cause for maybe the efficient cause. You're sacrificing the four for maybe one, and as a result, the dead actually then brings forth an experience of reality that is lesser reality. And so it would actually, in that sense, be unjust not to erase the debts, because the debts are actually creating a way of experience reality that's transactional. That is sort of that is just a logic of transaction, as opposed to opening that up and having a fuller vision of things, which is going to be leading toward the beautiful. And then if we do not do that, then in the name of achieving, what is owed to us per se, we deny from ourselves what is possible of us, which is an experience of the beautiful, the movement of the formation of humans according to the love that moves the sun and mother stars. So I very much appreciate that take on the parables. I think that thinking time as prior to space is getting at some of the various ironies we find ourselves in. And perhaps we could also say that a problem with in the debt logic in that parable is that there's a loss of considerateness. There's a loss of this consideration of the other in the name of the transaction, which is quite odd, because ultimately what we want are not even transactions. We want spaces of relation. And the logic of transactions gets in the way of that. But with that, my dear friend, I will run this evening. I appreciate your time. It is always good to speak with you, Matthew. Thank you.
I appreciate your time too. Great to see you, Daniel, and someday in 3 dimensions, perhaps.
Yes, sir.
Someday soon.
Yes,
Someday soon.
sir. I look forward to that. Thank you, Matthew.